because it's already streaming. All right, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to Friday's Drumversations with Dr. Mark Lomax. It's good to have you here. Today is a good day. Personally, I'm feeling better today than I have in a long time, and I hope you are too. Even with everything going on in the country and around the world, you know, we still have to cherish those good days and those good times. Today we want to talk about power versus authority, given what's going on in the government and around the country. But before we get to that, we want to just take some time to breathe and to remember who we are. So breathe in and out. Breathe in, out. When we breathe in, it's all the goodness the universe has for us. When we breathe out, it's all the crazy stress, anxiety, foolishness that society tries to put in. Breathe in the good and out the bad. In the good and out the foolishness. Cool. Again, we do that always to develop synchronicity. Always, in remembering who we are, we want to honor our ancestors. So as I play the ancestral drum call, put your ancestors in the chat and we will call them out afterwards. Ernestine Cox, Ashe. Norma Thomas, Ashe. Grandma and Grandpa, Ashe. Uncle David, Ashe. Uncle Phil, Ashe. Aunt Elizabeth, Ashe. Asheo, we honor all of our direct ancestors and those who we consider ancestors because they've been important in our lives and in the world. So in the last couple of weeks, even in Columbus, there have been reports of what can only be called secret police, secret federal agents, secret being meaning that they don't have any badges or form of identification that are presented upon their snatch and grab of people who are involved in civil disobedience and engaging in this fight against authoritarianism and fascism that we're seeing Donald Trump and the folks who control him and the folks who are his cronies impose upon this republic. Again, not democracy, republic, whole other thing. See, a few episodes ago, we talked about that. But in thinking about all of this stuff, COVID, police brutality, ongoing issues with race, class, gender, and now the Trump administration ratcheting up the crazy, all in the name of power and authority, and then the discussions that have been going on since, before there was an America about what is power and what is authority, particularly in the case of the presidency. I wanted to have a discussion about what I think the difference is between power and authority, and not just the difference between those ideas, concepts, but the difference in terms of how we understand them and what they really are. These are my thoughts. If you disagree, that's great. I'd love to have that conversation. But maybe after I'm done, you'll agree. And if not, then, we'll sit down for a virtual beer. But I really do think understanding these two issues, power and authority, is a step that has to be taken to create a more just and equitable society. I think there is a critical error in the way notions of power have been defined in modern times, and that a more substantive grasp of the term itself has implications that create a distinct differentiation between the concept of power and authority. Power, based on the dictionary on my Mac, is the ability to do something or act in a particular way, especially as it relates to one's faculty or quality. It also says power is the capacity or ability to direct or influence. Direct, ability, capacity, important words there. Influence also. The behavior of others or the course of events, right? Two others, one is pertaining to physical strength and force exerted on something or someone, and then energy that is produced by mechanical, electrical, or other means. These, in my view, are all external factors. But where does power come from? Nothing in this set of 4 definitions in the dictionary really talk about what power is or the source. They really reflect on the outward manifestation of power, right? Authority, by comparison, is power or right to give to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. The power or right to give orders, make decision, or enforce obedience. A person or organization having power or control in a particular situation, typically political or administrative sphere. Sorry, I can't read my own writing. And then it says authority is also the power to influence others, especially because of one's commanding manner or one's recognized knowledge about something. So if you're an expert, you're an authority. But if you have authority in this context, you have the power to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. Synonyms for authority are power, command, control, permission, dominance, right? Supremacy, influence. What's interesting about these definitions is that you can't necessarily have authority without power, but you can have power and no authority depending on context. But in any case, we still, even now that we've gone through the definitions of power and authority, don't understand or haven't gleaned, I haven't, from these definitions, what power is and where it comes from. I know what it does, right? It directs or influences, right? It imposes force on something, right? It is an action, it's a verb, but in a noun, in the context of a noun, what is it, where does it come from? I think one of the issues with these two words and the way that they're used synonymously when we talk about political power and other forms of power is that it focuses, one, using authority and power synonymously, I think obfuscates what power really is. And two, it brings it outside of the self, right? If you think about the origins of power, we talked a few weeks ago that Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, said power begins at the point of conception. Power begins at the point of conception. So the definition terms shows us what you do with power, right? The ability to influence or to bring about something through force or what have you. But when you think about power beginning at the point of conception, that is not imposing one's will or one's power on anything. Conception is internal. Conception is perception. And conception defines vision and reality, right? So the internal idea of power, to me, is getting closer to the source, right? If power begins at the point of conception, then power was never not there, right? The fourth definition starts with the word energy. Well, energy can neither be created nor destroyed, right? Spirit is energy. It's a form of energy. Energy is vibration. Human beings have spirits. Human beings are manifestations of energy. Therefore, human beings innately are power. We are power. And if we are power, then we have power. That's the internal, I think, or intrinsic source of power, is that we are power incarnate. So why is it that our definitions are all external? Why is it that when you try to understand this idea of power, none of them point to you? None of those definitions point to you and who you are and what you have because you're human, right? In America, the nightmare, I think, of America is a general Eurocentric conception of self that has shifted the value proposition from that which is optimal, talking about intrinsic power, optimal, spirit, intrinsic, multidimensional, to one that is suboptimal, meaning material or fragmented individualism, right? Because when you deal only with the external, that's a fragmentation, right? That's a material or physical exertion of power without really understanding where it comes from. That, to me, is more aligned with what we understand about authority, right? We'll talk more about authority when we come back. Yeah.
Someone said because they're oppressing us, so part of the conversation.
So we had a comment about oppressing. So yeah, so the plutocracy, right? The wealthy elite that controls what's going on politically and otherwise. I do agree that the notions of power have been shifted to be extrinsic rather than intrinsic to allow them to oppress us, right? So that gets to the point I was going to make here. That shift that you mentioned in terms of oppression has led to a subconscious dissonance where we often feel like we are made for more or have a higher purpose than we're really able to realize because the way we have been taught is away from our true selves, our actual innate power, right? So when you begin to believe that you're powerful because it begins at the point of conception, then you start to see beyond the matrix. And when you're seeing beyond the matrix in that way, then you can no longer be controlled or oppressed. Because you have to, Steve Biko said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mindset of the oppressed. So if I am an oppressor, I have to convince you that your oppression is normal, that a state of powerlessness is normal. And I have to also convince you that not only is that normal, but that I am the only one that can confer power, which is not actual power, but authority upon you. And then you are only use what power I've given you in the service of my actual power. That's oppression. So you're absolutely right.
Uncle Gary said spiritual essences are given power. It's always present.
Absolutely. Spiritual essences, Uncle Gary, is exactly what that is. It's energy. Energy is power, which means you're born with it. You're born into that flow because you come from it. We come from it. And so a realization of our innate power, the power that we have just because we exist, is one of the first steps to overthrowing oppression and the oppressor. That's why Kwame Ture said it starts at the point of conception. Because if it is in the mind in terms of the oppressor's control over the oppressed, then as soon as the oppressed realize that they no longer have to be oppressed because they have power to not be, that changes everything.
Diane Foote says my challenge is staying in that power, my power.
Hi, Diane. She said the challenge is staying in the power, staying in that position of power. Well, yeah, I had that problem too, and still to some extent. I mean, it's an evolution, right? Nobody's got it all together. But what I've learned is I redefine everything from a position of power that benefits me, that benefits my family, that benefits my community. So even in the context of my 9 to 5, right? I don't say that I have a boss. I don't have a boss. I'm my own boss. When I decide to leave, I will leave. If I get fired, more often than not, knowing me, it's because I made a decision and said or did something that justified their discomfort with me, but I still made the decision to go, right? I'm not going to get Nick Cannoned because I'm going to do what I need to do consciously and make decisions. So when I think about that kind of a contract, I'm thinking that I am making a partnership deal, right? They are going to pay me for a service, and I'm going to provide that service in exchange for resources. That's a different concept of job, in this case, than I'm going to go work for them. Because when I'm working for, I'm giving something. And when I say it's a partnership, then there's an equitable relationship there, right? They can choose not to pay me, but I can also choose not to do the work. So from a contractual situation, I see that as equal partnership, which brings the power dynamic into some form of equity. So even if they don't believe that, that's irrelevant. That's how I see those things, right? So I try to reframe every situation I find myself in from a deficit position, which is what we're taught, to a position of strength. And the more you get comfortable seeing yourself that way and manifesting yourself that way, right? Being powerful, the more comfortable you get staying in that lane, the easier it becomes to stay within your power, right? You've published a book. That's a powerful thing, right? The feeling that you had as you were working through the publishing process, writing the book, conceptualizing the book, all of those things are working in your power, right?
She said if more could understand this, great advice. Viola says it's been fascinating watching which groups have stood up during these 3.5 years. Groups you would not think being part of checks and balances have in fact been a check.
Yeah, so that's what the founding fathers were always afraid of, right? That people, in the chat, it's talking about people who are standing up that you might not expect. But power has always served, in the context of Eurocentric values, has always served to keep their foot on someone, to oppress someone, to maintain their power. So when you see people starting to take their power back, to recognize that they're powerful, and then leverage that power in community, it surprises not only power, but it surprises the community itself, right? So we need more of that. We need more people acting in ways that leverage their personal power in community to bring justice, equity to our community, right? It is through, to kind of piggybacking on the Steve Biko thing, and kind of what Diane was saying, the reason why it's so hard to sit in that power is because we've been socialized against our authentic selves, right? We've been socialized against our more authentic self in a way that keeps us from being that. That's why you see poor white men, what they've called recently the white working class, up in arms, right? And they see it as a racialized context, whether it's against Hispanics or African Americans or gender difference or women even. But that's not the actual problem. The actual problem is that they're being oppressed just like everybody else. But because of the white hand of fellowship, right, they are white male, they don't see or feel the oppression in the same way that women of color in particular, and people of color in general feel it, because it's obvious, right? It's obvious that if you look like me, you were enslaved at a certain time in this country, right? Where if I was Irish, I might have been an indentured servant, but at some point I became white, and that was never my problem again, right? Even though I made kind of like a teensy baby step socially from indentured servant, which was a form of slavery, to whiteness, I did not necessarily have the economic mobility to improve my class status. And so I continued to be oppressed through economics, but that's soft oppression, right? That's not the obvious oppression of slavery. And so they get dogged, poor white folk, just like everybody else, but it looks different, right? And that's the game, right? In both cases, whether it's physical oppression, or economic oppression in terms of class, that's all psychological violence, right? Because in either case, you are urged forcefully to accept your station as less than. And once you believe that this is normal, then it's hard to overcome that, right? That's why we're having so many problems with folks like AOC or anybody who stands up to white men who have authority and the white power structure in America, because they're used to just saying this is how it is, defining reality, and everybody else going with it. And so now you have people who are done, they're tired, and we're not having it anymore. And the question becomes, can we not just take back our power, but can we leverage our collective power to have authority? We'll talk about that after I come back. We've got some more ancestors.
Charles Bell,
Charles Bell, Ashe.
William Bell,
William Bell, Ashe.
Ed Bell,
Ed Bell, Ashe.
Edna Bell,
Edna Bell, Ashe.
Danielle Bell,
Danielle Bell, Ashe.
Mike Bell,
Mike Bell, Ashe.
and George Bell.
And George Bell, Ashe. Ashe. We'll always take time for the ancestors. So, difference between power and authority. Uh-huh.
You've got some conversation about it.
Oh,
Scott Wood says community is definitely not always prepared to process power from within its ranks. It's why education must always be a component of liberation.
Ashe. Scott Wood said education must always be a component of liberation because the community is not always prepared to process power. And I agree with that absolutely in terms of education and our ability to process. And the reason why we can't process is because we don't know, right? That's why that quote from Steve Biko is so important. The most important, most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, right? To Scott's point about education, you don't know what you don't know. And so if we're teaching ourselves that we are powerful, then it makes us less ripe for oppression, right? It makes us, it puts us in a position where it's harder for people to oppress us because we know. That's why during slavery, they separated the children from the parents, particularly the children from the mother. Because if I look at my mother, I have a sense of who I am. My mother can pass down belief systems, notions of God, notions of, you know, our history culturally, ideas, values, all these things that make me who I am, and I retain my humanity. But if I am snatched from my mother, then there's a void, and that void is then filled with the ideas of the oppressor. This is what Ibram Kendi talks about in his book, How to Be Anti-Racist. What we have been fed, and this is that psychological violence, are racist ideas. And part of that education process is undoing the psychological violence, healing and becoming whole so that our power becomes evident to us. And not only that we understand our power, but we now know how to work in our power, like Diane said, together to make things different, right? It's not just about my power versus your power. It's about our power, right? I am powerful because you are. I am also powerful because I am. But in parts of Africa, they have this idea, Ubuntu, I am because we are, right? My power is because we are powerful. And your power is because we are powerful, right? Once we understand that, everything changes, right? And I see what's going on in the country, but I don't know, to Scott's point, if we are processing these events, these actions of social disobedience, civic disobedience, from the standpoint of power. But I guarantee that the folks who don't want this happening are processing it from a standpoint of power. What?
I will tell you something funny from Scott Woods' page.
Mhm.
He shared this. He said, only beef with Dr. Mark Lomax Drumversation series is that they happen on Friday. We do stuff talks and communal energies on Monday, so I know how my week is going.
Yeah, Scott posted on his page he wants us to move it to Monday, but this is Friday for Monday. You know what I'm saying? But he's right. These are important conversations because we don't have them elsewhere. And so here's the thing. How do we work within our power and engage power for real, right? So we talked about power in terms of the dictionary definitions as an outward manifestation of something that's happening inside, something that exists inside. We also talked about authority as something that conflates the idea of power, right? You can't have authority without power, but you can have power without authority. That's kind of where we are now, right? People, I hope, are waking up to their power, but that doesn't mean they necessarily have the authority. But I think if that authority to express their power, right? And by that I mean not just being out in the streets and protesting and even where necessary, rioting, but the authority to change things through leveraging our collective power for the good of all, right? So Dr. Wade Noble says the essence of power is the ability to define someone's reality and make them live according to that reality as though it is the reality of their choosing, right? When we talked about power, we talked about its ability to influence the behavior of others and change the course of events, right? So rising up in righteous indignation in acts of civil disobedience are one step toward realizing our power, but it's not the end all. That's why I have said protest and even the riot is a tactic, not a strategy, right? It's an end, not, I'm sorry, it's a means to an end, but not an end in of itself, right? So the power phrases in Wade Noble's definition is ability, define, reality, and to make. We have the ability to enforce. That's where authority comes in, right? When you're actualizing your power gives you authority. But in the context in which we live, we have to leverage our collective power and give ourselves the authority, right? And in doing that, we have to define the mechanisms by which we can make those lasting changes, right? That is strategy. Protest, riot, and even the vote is a tactic as part of the strategy to get to this end of a more just and equitable and inclusive society, right? So what is definition? When you're defining someone's reality, it means that you are informing or imposing a conception or vision of what reality is or could be, right? To define means to state or describe exactly the nature, scope, or meaning of, or establish the character of something, right? So when we are tapped into our power, that means we are creating a vision for what we want life to be. And when we are doing the work of making life that way, then we are exercising authority. Does that make sense? There's a difference. Power is the internal ability to see and be. Authority is doing. The president has the authority to order the military, has the authority to do some of the things that he's doing, but he doesn't have the power to change my idea of reality or my conceptualization of reality. He has no power to define for me what life will be. Because they can make laws, they can make rules, but as we learned from our enslaved ancestors, they physically might have been bound, but spiritually, in many cases, they were free, right? That's the difference between power and authority, right? Reality is perception, right? The state of things as they actually exist, substance. So musically, I've been told that when people listen to the music, when the band is killing and we're doing our thing, they're transported to this other place through a soundscape. Right? So in that moment, that musical moment, we are creating a new reality for the audience that we're sharing together. That is power, right? That's power leveraged in community. Because we can play on stage, but if people aren't there with us, if we're not resonating with those folks, then they don't go on the journey with us and create that new reality in that space. That's why I say we can use music as an example to create community in those spaces that might not have happened otherwise, because our intention is to establish a vibratory frequency that resonates with everyone and brings them to this new reality, at least for that moment. And then once you feel that reality, once you experience that, hopefully you're changed in a way that makes you want to go build that in your community and in the country, right? Power is the ability to define reality for others, for yourself and others, and make them live that way as if it's one of their own choosing. That's power and authority. Authority is the doing, right? So an internal way to think about it, for me, is that power is the external manifestation of an internal reality, and authority is the ability to establish and maintain that reality, right? Power is what you are. Authority is what you do with who you are and what you are. But what we're seeing in terms of the government right now are means by which they are maintaining the reality that they have put forth, that many people have accepted and are now rejecting, right? And I think there are many ways, but there are two primary ways that you can establish and maintain a particular reality, right? When you look back into the history of Africa prior to colonialism, prior to European imperialism, yes, of course, there were battles, there were skirmishes, there was war, quote unquote. I mean, people have had disputes since people existed. So I'm not saying that it was an a perfect world, but it was ideal because what we know is that in the great empires of Africa, while they had military and ways to defend themselves, that was not their first, nor was it their only recourse. Most of what we've learned is that those nation states kept order, so to speak, they exuded authority through spiritual consciousness, right? Through culture. Well, they weren't Europeans then, when the Greeks came to Kemet, ancient Egypt, they weren't killed on sight. They were allowed to learn, right? The difference is they came with a suboptimal consciousness and they took what they learned back to what would become Europe and then brought it back to own and control. That's the difference. And so one way is spiritual and cultural consciousness. The other way is through physical or material force and fear, right? And if you read Iceman Cometh and several other books, we understand that because of the Ice Age, what became Europe, those people suffered from a deficient mentality, a deficit mentality, because the lack of resources. And so they weren't able necessarily, as we understand now with people who are growing up in poverty, they weren't able to see the bigger picture because they were so concerned with what was right in front of them. Whereas in Africa, we had the sun. We had plenty of food and resources. We had plenty of material resources and natural resources, right? The Ashanti kings, gave away gold because they had so much of it. It wasn't even like a thing, right? I mean, there are so many other examples of what Europe calls material wealth that in Africa, we were just like, oh yeah, that's just what it is, because we didn't define wealth and value in terms of material, right? So what we see now is an administration who is using fear as a means of keeping their authority, right? 3 examples: Federal Secret Police in Columbus, Portland, Chicago, and elsewhere; divisive language along race, gender, and class lines, which impacts poor white folk, like I said, as much as anybody else. And then pervasive inequality also along race, gender, and class lines. Those are mechanisms by which those who call themselves in power use their authority to maintain their position, right? But in order to win, we must see beyond the veil to the truth of what we face, right? So I'm going to play something, but the question here is twofold. What do the plutocrats who control America have above and beyond the Constitution, like they exist above the law, right? What do they gain from maintaining authority through these various isms that divide us? And what happens if we really do become powerful in ourselves, wake up to our power, and leverage that power for change? We'll talk about that later. We got some more ancestors. Verna May and Frank Lomax. I shade. It was my grandparents. Love them. Miss them. So the question is, what do the plutocrats gain? And maybe the other question is not so much what do we gain by leveraging our own power and giving ourselves authority, but what do we have to lose, right? So I want to define these things in terms of suboptimal and optimal. Suboptimally, meaning in favor of the plutocracy, the end game always comes down to power, who has it and who doesn't, right? And it's what Dr. Leonard Jeffries calls the 3Ds: domination, destruction, and death. That's what Eurocentric European culture has caused all over the world. Like a virus, they have invaded elsewhere, places outside of what we know now as Europe, and they have caused or brought domination, destruction, and death. That's why I contextualize that as suboptimal, right? It's not good for anybody, right? So if you have to gain power or authority by killing other people, by dominating other people, and by destroying other cultures and ways of being, then that's not a reflection of power, because power, game recognizes game, right? Power recognizes power. If you have it, you respect it, and it becomes a part of a flow. That's the African optimal way, right? I am because you are, not I think, therefore I am, right? So the plutocrats, as a result of domination, destruction, and death, what they gain is not just more of that. Those are the tactics by which they maintain the status quo, which is materialistic, is an externalization of power that keeps us weak and divided, so they maintain the nightmare that is America, right? And the nightmare is the source of their power. And that's why I say, and a lot of people have said, we have to wake up to our own power. Because as long as we continue to just protest and even riot for a little while, and then things go back to normal, then we maintain the nightmare, because we have not gotten to the point where we're completely awake to what we actually are, and we are power. Nobody can you can't empower people, because when you empower something or someone, there's an assumption that you had no power to begin with. But what you can do is confer authority. My daughters are powerful because they're human, but they're my children. And so if I give my oldest the credit card, right, I'm giving her authority to expend resources in my name. But she doesn't have a credit card. She doesn't have money of her own. She just started a job, so she will. But she doesn't have money of her own, which means she doesn't have a form of power, right? So if she wants to go buy something, I have to give her the authority to expend those resources, because she doesn't have the power to make that decision on her own. That's one way to differentiate those two, right? So as long as we believe in the status quo, they maintain the power dynamic that has been established in America, right? And the death, destruction, and domination will continue. However, we can end the nightmare by uniting around an optimal vision of reality where our individual power is realized collectively to create an inclusive unity based on the intrinsic value of every human being. I'll say that again. We end the nightmare by uniting around an optimal vision of reality where our individual power is realized collectively to create an inclusive unity based on the intrinsic value of every human being. Basically, we have to become Voltron, right? What I mean by that is individually, we are powerful. Individually, we need to do the work of realizing our power. But our power means that much more when it's used in community. And when we come together as a powerful community, we give ourselves authority to change the reality. There's nothing 45, there's nothing any of the plutocracy can do. Whether it's Bezos, whose new net worth is about 182 billion, which is ridiculous. It'd take the average citizen who makes about $32,000 a year over 1,000,000 years to achieve that kind of wealth. That level of inequality is just another way to reinforce the nightmare and the sense of powerlessness. But that powerlessness, or the sensibility of powerlessness, that deficient mentality, is material. Just because he's got $180 some odd billion doesn't make him more powerful than you or I internally. We can flip that power dynamic, and collectively we have more power, and we can leverage that power to have the authority to change the reality. So there are 3 ways we can do that. We cannot lose when we are united in the spirit of an optimal human existence. We cannot lose when we unite in a spirit of optimal human existence. Why do I frame it that way? Because I don't want to be against anything. When you talk about what you hate or what you're against, that invites lower vibration. Our power comes from achieving the highest, most optimal frequency possible, right? So I'd rather come together in unity in the spirit of an optimal human existence, which means we are working to ensure that every human being in America, and by extension on the planet, can be their best selves, is encouraged to be their best selves, and that optimization of their human potential is facilitated by the community. I am because we are. We cannot lose when we maintain that kind of unity, right? We cannot lose when we practice a politics of humanity that derives from that unity, right? And the politics of humanity is it comes from that unity and is the outward expression of an internal balance, right? If I know my power, then there's no way that your power can make me feel insecure. In fact, I should feel more secure when I recognize your power, or when I recognize that you recognize your power, because I understand that together we are more powerful. I honestly think that in this ultra-human conception of power, that's why Africa accepted these people who had a lesser consciousness. By lesser, I mean deficit-based consciousness. Because while we might not have seen these folks before, they looked a little pale, right? They basically physically were constructed like us, and ultimately they were our children. And when they came home, they didn't come home to be a part of and add value. They came home to destroy, to dominate, and to kill, right? The third thing we can do, we cannot lose when we practice cooperative economics, right? So we have to unite in the spirit of an optimal human existence. We have to leverage that unity in the way that we engage each other, a politics of humanity. So that manages how we do our work, right? And then we have to generate resources through cooperative economics, right? So we give ourselves authority to expend the resources that we have in all of what that means, resource, not just money, time, talent, treasure, and whatever else. When we do those 3 things, regardless of what you look like in your ethnic background, when we unite because we're human, when we treat each other humanely, politics of humanity, and when we leverage our resources as human beings, cooperative economics, then we can't lose, right? So these practices give us authority to create and maintain a just, equitable, and inclusive society. We can't lose when we do those 3 things, right? So thank you for joining us on Friday for Drumversations. Make sure you click like, subscribe, and share if you dig what's going on. Ruth and I have a podcast on iTunes and Spotify and SoundCloud. Just Google Drumversations, Mark and Ruth, and it comes up. Episode 4 came out this week. Also, we've got a new album dropping next month. You can pre-order that. It's download only, no physical copies. But it's a recording of our last concert before COVID hit and the pandemic shut everything down. I think you'll enjoy that. So I'm going to play you out. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.